Welcome to Tales of Britain and Ireland. This is a podcast telling the stories, legends and folktales of Britain and Ireland in no particular order. Presented by Graham and coming direct from South Yorkshire, each episode tells a story or selection of stories from all across these islands and throughout their history, followed by a short and decidedly inexpert discussion of the origin and themes of each tale.
And welcome back, everybody. This is not a usual Tales of Britain and Ireland episode. It's really a little Christmas bonus. I had some time over Christmas and didn't want to miss out on all the good ghost storytelling. Well, the ghost storytelling, at least. In complete contrast to my last episode, therefore, the tale I present to you now I have changed very little. And I've got no real discussion section. I'm sort of front-loading all the discussion and making it much shorter than usual. Hopefully you can forgive this one-off change in structure and enjoy this little spooky ghost story. And regardless of any of that, I hope you had a wonderful Christmas, New Year, winter solstice, whatever it is that you celebrate, and whenever it is you're listening to this episode, be it in the middle of summer, I still hope you had a good one. So I should probably get on with it, shouldn't I? Except just to say that this probably isn't one for children, unless they have particularly stout stomachs. In 1911, the renowned scholar Montague Rhodes James, better known as M.R. James, published his second volume of ghost stories, More Ghost Stories of an Antiquary. This second volume was received with lavish praise in the press, and readers of his time loved it, cementing James's reputation as the foremost writer of ghost stories of his generation. A review in The Observer at the time was particularly complimentary. In the years since, and up against some stiff and highly well-regarded competition, for it seems that every great Victorian and Edwardian writer turned their hand to ghost stories, M.R. James's reputation has only continued to grow, and now he is largely regarded as the undisputed master of that literary form in English. Both directly and indirectly, his stories still exert an outsized influence on the genres of ghost story, horror and folk horror, and are the cause still of many a fitful night's sleep. It's very likely not just that most people listening to this have heard of James, but that you've probably read one of his books, or heard an audio play based on his works, or indeed seen one of the many dramatisations. Quite possibly at Christmas. Now, More Ghost Stories of Antiquary was reviewed in The Observer along with another book, released at about the same time, the two reviews in one column. This other book was Elliot O'Donnell's Scottish Ghost Stories. Elliot O'Donnell held a far less distinguished position than a Cambridge Don, but he wasn't exactly badly done for. But at this time of his life he was just finding his place in the world, having lived in various places, in his native Bristol, various places in Ireland from where his father hailed, Oregon, Chicago, Cornwall and London, amongst others, taking jobs as a cattle rancher, a policeman, a travelling theatre actor and a journalist, amongst others. Proper Mr. Benning it. Scottish Ghost Stories was O'Donnell's fifth book on the supernatural, and he had published two books earlier that very year. The review in The Observer begins with a glowing commendation of M.R. James's new work, and then turns to the section on Scottish Ghost Stories by Elliot O'Donnell, and it says, and I paraphrase slightly, quote, "Beside Dr. James's, Mr. O'Donnell's ghost stories are foolish and feeble things. If any of the bogles whom Mr. O'Donnell has now expounded in 5 volumes have any basis in fact, we can only commiserate the ordinary ghost for its tameness, sameness, and general imperfect equipment of horror as compared with the eerie and ingenious spectres of Dr. James." End quote. Ooh, tell us what you really think. A slightly more generous but carefully hedged reviewer in a Sheffield paper says, quote, "The stories are fairly well told, for the most part, but the uncanny has played so distinguished a part in Scottish literature," and here the reviewer gives a list of a good number of well-known weird stories from Scotland, that these stories cannot but suffer by comparison with the masterpieces they bring to mind. Unquote. Eek. For what it's worth, I think the critics on this are correct. So of course today, just to be contrary, I'm not going to tell you an M.R. James ghost story. There are lots of tellings out there by people with masterful voice acting credentials and elite level soundscaping to satisfy all your most spine-tingling desires. Instead, I'm telling you an Elliot O'Donnell ghost story, to which I may be more suited. Now, despite his at best lukewarm reviews, O'Donnell was only getting warmed up, and over the next 50 years he went on to write a staggering number of books about ghosts, along with articles in magazines and newspaper and the like. He was a prolific author, public speaker on the topic, wildly popular and well known in his day. I feel it is incumbent upon me to point out that, unlike M.R. James, O'Donnell's stories were purported to be true accounts of ghosts, either that he had encountered personally or about which he'd been told. I've actually told one of his already on the podcast, The Thing at Berkeley Square, as part of my previous Christmas Ghost Stories episode. And there I recounted it as something that may have happened, with some degree of scepticism, admittedly. And if you take O'Donnell at his word, then clearly these stories should be considered in a different category from M.R. James, because it stands to reason. O'Donnell doesn't have the freedom to create narratives that may be satisfying to the consumer, the reader, but instead must report faithfully the facts as they are. And viewed in such a light, the comparison of the observer-writer feels distinctly unfair, misplaced, you might say. O'Donnell is not really an author of fictions, he is, as he frequently characterises himself, a ghost hunter. He's not writing in a literary tradition, he is an investigator. His accounts, as he sometimes titles them, his cases, are factual reports. While James and others might write as though their stories are true, there is no genuine pretence, it is just an affectation. But for O'Donnell, his stories are clearly true, and thus his first duty is not to entertain, but is to the truth. Just so you know, I am maintaining a perfectly straight face as I say all of this. It's largely because of the purported veracity of O'Donnell's stories that I actually feel comfortable doing a retelling on the podcast. Pretty much as a rule, I do not tell stories where there is a clear named author of the whole thing. I try to limit myself to stories where someone is repeating or rewriting a tale that they have heard elsewhere. Whether this is actually true in all cases, MC Balfour, is up for debate, but that's the idea. I'm not just here to read out other people's words, and I've generally got no interest in rewriting literary text where, as I see it, the exact form, the words themselves, are a crucial, integral part of the tale, unlike in folk stories. The only time I have done a story like that before, also during my previous Christmas episodes, was The Shadow, and I read that word for word to mixed responses, so I'm not going to be doing that again. But with O'Donnell's stories, well, he must have got them from someone in turn and rewritten them couched in his own distinct phraseology, because they are definitely true. To give you a proper appreciation of their factual nature, you should know that from O'Donnell's detailed accounts of his life, we are left with the very distinct impression that this was a man who could barely go down to the corner shop for a packet of peanuts without both encountering himself veritable hordes of ghosts, ghouls, elementals, boggarts and demons, and encountering people just desperate to offload to him lengthy narratives of their own encounters with similar, people who demanded at the same time perfect anonymity. It must have made his life a real hassle, particularly when he finally got his peanuts open and yet again found two glowing red eyes staring at him from the sepulchral darkness of the packet's ancient eerie innards. But for O'Donnell, that was just Tuesday. According to an aside in one of his books, only 1 in 1,000 people is capable of sensing, seeing the supernatural, which might rather explain why our society doesn't have the sort of per capita level of murder by ghost one would expect if a tenth of O'Donnell's accounts reflected reality. Now, there are literally hundreds of stories I could have picked from O'Donnell. His output was prodigious. But this particular story was one I read quite a long while ago, maybe one of the first ones I read of his, and it left an impression. I pick it for no particular other reason. Though looking at the time that I'm recording this might actually end up coming out around Hogmanay or shortly thereafter, and I suppose a Scottish Piper ghost is pretty appropriate for that. It is perhaps the most notably, definitely Scottish in the collection, by which I mean it has a highly stereotyped Scottish ghost, And so I've gone with it, and now you're getting it as a little Christmas bonus. In case you haven't picked up on my general tone here, I'm going to be completely clear with a disclaimer. Many genuine Scottish tales of encounters with ghosts are available from folklore and from real-life accounts too. I may even tell some on this podcast at some time, possibly to atone for this. You are very welcome, nay encouraged, to go seek them out. Do it now. But if you opt to stay with me, to indulge this strange soft spot I have for the seemingly universally panned Elliot O'Donnell, foremost ghost hunter of the early 20th century, then I would like to share with you my retelling of the Ghosts of Donaldgowerie House. This story is set on the outskirts of Perth. I will forego my usual extended introduction to the location, except to say that Perth is the original, not its now more famous Australian namesake. And that, like basically every major Scottish town or city, the fair city has, in times not too distant, been the stage for not just terrible violence between rival Scottish clans, between Scottish and English armies, but also played host to the regular assault, suicide and murder that background everyday life. That is to say, of grisly and unfortunate deaths, there have been many in Perth. But this story occurred at the very end of the 19th century, the age of progress, the 20th century dawning, a century surely when such horrors belonged to an age long past, were never likely to occur again. Elliot O'Donnell was of course told this story. He's a well-dressed gentleman, a thick woolen coat over a fine tailored suit, the look topped off with a broad-brimmed black hat, which for want of a better place he sets down on the table in front of him. Still a relatively young man, his face is lean, cheekbones prominent. He listens intently to every word, a sparkle in his eye. He makes no notes, but it's clear to his interviewee that his keen mind absorbs each and every detail. "You won't believe me." "Try me," says Elliot. There is a shaking of the head. "You see, Mr. O'Donnell, do you believe in ghosts?" A kind, understanding smile forms on O'Donnell's lips. "As a matter of fact, I do." "Well, okay then." And the interviewee begins to talk. The tale O'Donnell is told goes something like this, though with rather fewer wry and, quite frankly, unnecessary observations and asides. It started with a house that was going very cheaply indeed, which should really have raised more of a concern. Donaldgowerie House, they called it. Donaldgowerie could have gone for twice the price, and only the need for some repairs, and the fact that the sellers were in, quote, urgent need of money, cash-only sale, immediate, no backsies, could explain it. Mr. Whittingen was the buyer. Whittingen was not his real name, of course. Names have been changed throughout to protect the innocent and the guilty alike. Well, Mr. Whittingen almost felt sorry for them. Almost. But not quite as much as he felt very clever for having bagged himself such a bargain. And now he took stock of what was his, a large rambling house in a prime spot on the outskirts of Perth. What might be termed a hall today, a stately home, a large, many-roomed property, not just space for the family, but for the many servants, of course. Now, he didn't really need such a bargain price, for Mr. Whittingen had done very well for himself in life. A grocer by trade, a much more distinguished trade than now, career had been spent in Jedburgh, and there he had been twice elected mayor. He was now moving to Perth on his well-deserved retirement at a pretty young age for retirement by today's terms. Given all these details and further that will follow, I'm not really quite sure how the name changes are achieving the alleged goal of anonymity here. Even pre-Google, it feels like we could work out who this was fairly easily. But out of respect for the family, I have not tried to identify this clearly very real and easy to identify figure. Much of Mr. Whittingen's family came with him. His wife, of course, Mrs. Whittingen, and their 3 adult daughters. His 2 sons had already struck out into the world. The eldest, Ernest, had attended Oxford University, now a curate in the Church of England, no less. The younger, Harvey, had a shrewd mind and was a solicitor in Edinburgh. They were that kind of family. As Elliot O'Donnell puts it in language I can't entirely approve of, a family, quote, plain, practical, genteel, and in fact, very superior people, unquote. And I honestly don't know if O'Donnell is throwing shade or heaping praise on them with this comment. The daughters were well educated. They'd attended a high-class English seminary, where they'd had a rather rounded education, learnt music, science, needlework, history, literature, geography, languages, even spent time in France and Germany to perfect the accents. It had made them highly intelligent, knowledgeable, skilled. But despite this, their prospects in life were rather different than their brothers. Regardless of their many talents, there were no professions for them to enter. Their lives could only truly begin once they had acquired husbands, and thereafter they would get on with the important business of raising children. In the meantime, they moved with their father and mother to the new family home, and it was hoped that soon enough they would be near buried under the vast number of calling cards from all the most eligible gentlemen of Perthshire. You've read Austen, seen Bridgerton, played dating sims, you know how it's meant to work. I'm sure all three of them were positively delighted at this state of affairs. And this is really their story. Ruth, Martha and Mary, names changed, of course. Thoroughly modern women, but they had been taught the right blend of grace, beauty and romance in their soul that would surely see them snapped up by suave Scottish suitors in spookily short order. Alas, distinguishing their characters is difficult, as I suppose in a real-life account it would be. I am confident they all had rich inner lives and were distinct people, but their situation being so similar, and this rather defined them, I do struggle to flesh out their different personalities. Mr. and Mrs. Whittington were very soon involved in the business of introducing themselves to and meeting the county, throwing open their new home to host a dizzying array of gatherings, dinners and dances, garden parties, tennis matches, music and poetry recitals, afternoon teas, sophisticated soirees, probably some sort of breakfast activity as well. A 24-hour schedule of parties and functions for our retirees and their eligible bachelorette daughters, it appears. And this busy schedule was to reach the next level when their eldest son, Ernest, the Reverend-to-be, returned to the home to stay with them a while, mostly for the purposes of introducing his new English bride. Everyone must meet her. And over the course of a week or two, near enough everyone in the county was invited to Donaldgowerie House. And by that I mean a tiny subsection of society rich enough to be considered, well, people visited the house. For the daughters, urged on by their father and mother, it meant an opportunity to meet a lot of men. And we opened as Mary and Martha have just finished a game of croquet with two such eligible gents. Steamy stuff. The four were drinking lemonade, bosoms heaving, waistcoats scandalously loosened, when Mary mentioned photographs of herself. Tasteful photographs, I'm sure, and her prospective partner, eyebrow raised perhaps, said how much he would enjoy gazing upon them. Mary facaded a giggle and a blush. "Oh, sir, you flatter me. They are but trifling things." "Oh, no, I am quite serious, my dear creature, and if it pleases you, then I would see these immediately. My very heart leaps at the idea of witnessing such refined beauty frozen in time." "Oh, sir, if you do insist." And off went Mary to fetch them. Conversation and lemonade flowed, but a couple of glasses down, and Mary still absent, both slowed, and then awkwardly stopped. Martha asked, "Where has she got to?" "Apologies, gentlemen. If you could just kindly wait for us a moment, I will go and find her." And then Martha angrily went off to look for Mary. Martha made her way upstairs. It was a very large house, and by the time she was on the second floor, Martha was well away from the hustle and bustle of the party. Here all was silent and still, and she was quite alone as she made her way along a long, gloomy corridor, at the end of which lay her sister's bedroom, door ajar. Annoyed at Mary, Martha was just starting to cry out her sister's name when her voice caught in her throat as a man emerged from the open door. Under his arm he carried bagpipes, and he was clad in the antiquated dress of some Highlander. Martha was shocked to her very core. She stopped and stared. She should say something. But an unnatural hush filled the corridor emanating from him, and she found herself horribly transfixed as he walked. No, not quite walked. Moved towards her, gliding closer and closer. She could make out his face in detail, his eyes fixated on hers, an unnatural, pallid greyness to his skin, a wicked, malevolent smile on his lips. But her breath came fast and short, and she really should cry out. That grin got wider, and in no time at all he was right upon her. She was cold with terror, hairs raising, mouth opening in a silent scream, that horrible, grinning, deathly face right up to hers, staring intently as he got closer and closer and stepped right into her. Her ability to move returned suddenly. She turned, and as she did so, she saw him emerge from the other side of her body, continue on, pass straight through an upper house window as though it did not exist. And then she could see him no more. Now, she screamed, and she turned, ran to Mary's room, heart pounding, stomach churning at what she might find there. Her sister was sprawled on the floor, cheeks ashen pale, lips blue, breathing shallowly. Summoned by her screams, a few moments later, in rush a cast of supporting characters and start to attend to Mary in calmly, understandably hysterical Martha. There followed, as is customary for such occasions, much commotion, before, thankfully, Mary was finally roused. At first, she was woozy and frightened, but when she realised she was surrounded by friends and family, her emotions almost immediately took a turn towards the furious. Why was he allowed in here? She demanded. Freakish, horrible man. She was a wealthy young woman. She should not have to encounter people like that. They had servants to ensure precisely that they did not need to mix with people like that. That lunatic! How did he get in here? People stayed silent, Martha included, for whatever reason. Shock, I'm sure. Encountering only baffled looks, Mary continued. That Piper! I'd just got my album of tasteful photos, and I turned around, and here he was, in my room, looking at me with the most awful stare. She drifted off, then shook herself. I know I should have screamed, Papa, I should have run, but... She cast her eyes down in seeming confusion. But he touched me, and his hands were like, they were so cold, and then he started playing, marching up and down, pacing back and forth, and piping that dismal dirge. I can hear it now. You must have heard it. It was so loud. She looked imploringly at the group surrounding her, who exchanged looks of their own, and there was a shaking of heads. How could you not hear it? She paused again. A madman he must have been. I was sure he was here to murder me, but he just kept playing those infernal pipes, that horrible drone. But he didn't stop, and I think I must have fainted. And then you woke me up, and he was gone. Another silent pause. And then her rage seemed to return in full, and in the group of concerned onlookers she spied the head footman, and subjected him to a fiery blast of approbation. Why was such a person allowed in here? Why didn't you stop him? I saw no one, miss. How could you not? What were you doing? Miss, the second footman spoke up in defence of his colleague. The servant-to-family ratio was pretty high in this household, I think. He simply couldn't have got up here without anyone seeing, and he certainly could not have left. And Mary was soon the recipient of gazes sceptical and starting to be rather suspect of Mary's entire fitness of mind. Mr. Whittingham was now in a bit of a pickle. He could accuse his daughter of lying, which wouldn't end well. Not very supportive dad, that. But if he was to accuse the servants, well, then the servants might up and leave, and as O'Donnell notes, good domestics are scarce in Perth, as elsewhere. So he ummed and ahed a bit and finally said, "Are you sure about this, dear?" "Of course I'm sure. It's not the sort of thing one would imagine, is it? That man was here and he was playing his pipes and they nearly burst my ears." "Oh, right," said a crestfallen Mr. Whittingham, who maybe had hoped that his daughter would just say, "Sorry, on reflection, must have been mistaken, was just a mouse." For a moment or two there was an impasse, but finally Martha spoke up. "I saw him too, though, here in the corridor, but, Father, he passed right through me, and then he passed right through the window." She pointed, and the assembled company turned as one, beheld the perfectly intact window far above the ground. "Cannot be," said the footman. "There was nobody here." "You don't understand. He passed clean through it, and he disappeared." Trying to process what he was hearing here, Mr. Whittingham said, "Are you suggesting a ghost? A ghost in the middle of the day?" Martha nodded. "That's it, yes, a ghost." Twice former Mayor Whittingham tried to process this. Martha now started to laugh herself. A ghost. And her sister handed her a wine glass of smelling salts. Smelling salts which they just happened to have on hand. I suppose an upper-middle-class family saw smelling salts as practically a Waitrose essential in a house where there were 3 unmarried young women. But Martha breathed it in hard as her father considered. If the 2 flirting croquet players had come to witness events, I think it's about this stage, looking down at the erstwhile objects of their affections, alternately laughing and crying maniacally, while huffing smelling salts like they were going out of fashion, that the 2 surreptitiously slipped away. "Right," said Mr. Whittingham finally. "So, the important thing is that everybody is unharmed, and nobody lied. Everyone was right. It was just a ghost." For a moment he seemed like he needed the smelling salts himself, but pulled himself together. He was a gentleman. He knew what must be done in situations like this. "So, this is what we will do. We will all just forget about it for now, and indeed, forever. Girls, take your time, pull yourself together, and then come back to the party. Oh, and of course we do not want to worry your dear mother, so don't tell her." He addressed the servants. "Don't tell your mistress." And that was that. Everything would be all right just as long as they didn't think or talk about it. That was sure to work. A week passed and things seemed to be normal enough. It was exactly a week since those events. Mary was out in the garden. It was September, but the weather was fair. Her sister-in-law, the unnamed recent bride of Ernest, the Oxford-educated curate, remember? She called to Mary. "Mary, come here." And Mary ran to her over the croquet lawn. Her foot caught a carelessly abandoned croquet hoop. She tripped, fell forwards, and as her head hit the floor hard, it drove a long, sharp hat pin right into her skull with a horrifying crunch. And then the screaming began. Now, yes, this is some Final Destination shit, but it wasn't as instantaneous as all that. It took weeks for Mary to finally die, of blood poisoning in the end. Of course, the tragedy hit the family hard indeed. But Martha was most affected of all, for while the others were simply deep in grief, Martha began to rant and rave about how it was the piper that did it, the piper. She'd seen his eyes, that smile, that damned piper. She didn't know how or why, but she knew that he'd done it. It didn't matter that he wasn't there on the lawn. It was his malign influence. That piper. Now her sister, her best friend, was gone, killed somehow, she knew, by a ghost. Her and Ruth, the other sister, who had not been there the day of the encounter with the piper, they began to come increasingly close, spent much time together consoling one another. Though Ruth did find herself concerned with Martha's flights of wild fancy. As for the piper, though every time Martha went to that corridor she expected to see him, he was not seen. No phantom drone of bagpipes could be heard from attic or cellar. While the mood of all who inhabited it was dark indeed, the house itself seemed to be just a regular house. They left Mary's room empty. Gentlemen callers came to the house now only to respectfully pass on their deepest sorrows, commiserations, and to leave flowers. We leave the family to their mourning for a while, and join them again near Christmas, gathered around the evening fire, 4 of them, mother, father, and 2 daughters. Their conversation stilted and melancholy as oft it was. Outside was pitch black. The fire crackled. Their voices drifted off. They wallowed in a sad, contemplative silence around the flames. From outside they heard a sound, a rumbling of the wheels of a heavy coach on the high road. Not entirely unusual, but what caught everyone by surprise was when there was the crunch of gravel as the coach turned into their long carriageway. And down it fair hurtled, the noise of the gravel indicating it was going at one hell of a speed. This was all highly irregular. "A carriage!" exclaimed Mrs. Whittington, "at this time of night, and driven so recklessly! Who could it be?" They heard the coach pull up at the front door and stop. There came the sounds of chomping and stomping of the horses, of people descending, all the usual carriage stuff, but at a most unusual time of night. A great heavy knocking reverberated through the house. And while they'd heard the door many times, somehow it was never quite like this. The echo that passed through the whole house and into the drawing room in which they sat brought with it a dread. Hairs raised on the back of every neck. They waited, breath bated, for the servants to rush to open the front door, but unaccountably none were going for it. The great knocks came again, echoing through the house so clearly as though it were some vast stone mausoleum. No servant went for it. They knew the door was bolted on the inside. Nevertheless, they heard the creaking of hinges, signifying that great wooden portal swinging open. There was a crack as it hit the wall, and then the front door creaked to a close. And now the heavy tread of footsteps approaching the drawing room. That deep, dark dread had seized hold each and every one of them. Mrs. Whittingham gave a low, terrified moan. Mr. Whittingham tried to get up, to reach for the bell, to summon the servants, but when he did, he found his legs had lost all their strength, and he collapsed immediately back into his chair. Of the 4 of them, it was only Martha who managed to get up, lock the drawing-room door, then retreated backwards. All eyes were drawn to that door as the footsteps got closer. They stopped just on the other side. The handle turned. And then, in complete defiance of the lock, they'd seen Martha turn. The door swung gently open, revealing behind it simply shadows. Shadows of figures, but not cast upon wall or floor, but shadows in the very air itself. Shadows with substance. Unnatural, ghastly things stood at the threshold. Figures that held something as equally awful and unseen. Voices caught in throats. Time stood still. And then there was a loud thump. Martha looked round in shock to see Ruth, who had fallen to the floor in a dead faint. And when she looked back at the doorway, the shadows were retreating. The main door was flung open by no hand at all, and a snowflake wind roared into the hall and drawing room, a great blast of icy air. Then with a final crash, the front door slammed shut again, and the crunch of gravel signified the coach leaving. Their capacity for action suddenly rushed back in, and the family moved, once again, gathered around a daughter, passed out. Wet towels and smelling salts were fetched, and after long, worried minutes, they did their work. Ruth's eyes flickered open, her face etched with terror. "It's me! It's me! They came for me!" "What do you mean? Didn't you see them? Didn't you see them?" But while it was certain in Ruth's mind, to the rest of them, it wasn't clear what had happened. But for her, it was unmistakable. I'm next, like her. I'm going to go, like Mary. Do not mention this again, please. Do not speak to me of this. Martha held Ruth in her arms. I won't, I promise. It turned out that the servants had heard nothing, and a canny Mr. Whittingham didn't reveal to them what had happened. Don't tell the servants, he said. We don't want it getting out the house is haunted. The servants will all leave, and the house's value doesn't bear thinking about. And so they did not tell the servants, and at Ruth's request they did not discuss it. And a week later, no ludicrous accident befell Ruth, but instead her appendix inflamed and burst. In tremendous agony, she was rushed to a hospital, a luxury at the time, for she had access to the very best medical care in the county. And during the operation to save her, Ruth died. She was buried just before Christmas, next to her sister. Now only Martha was left. Martha, whose days from then on were no longer filled with gold-edged calling cards and chaperoned encounters, dreams of future husbands, if ever she had truly dreamed of such, who no longer had the company of her two sisters, her constant companions throughout her life. She was alone now, living with her two parents and utterly bereft. The parents, with the distance of time, soon rationalised away the uncanny elements of Ruth's demise. Tragedy weighs heavy on the mind, they said. The memories of that night must surely be wrong. They never talked about it with the servants or each other, pressed those memories down, buried them under the weight of their loss. That loss itself inelegantly buried under all manner of businesses, day in, day out. Their two worried sons visited regularly. Ernest's wife had a baby. Mr. and Mrs. Whittingham were grandparents now. They busied themselves with that. A small joy in the darkness that their lives had become. Gradually, month after month, their lives glacially shifted towards a new normality. Martha was an aunt, and she doted on her nephew, whose visits were frequent. And by the next Christmas, with no more ghosts appeared, even she eventually began to find the faintest glimmers of hope, of a future, once again. It was well over a year since Ruth's death now, Easter rapidly approaching. Martha, this day, found herself alone in the house. By which I, of course, don't mean she was actually alone. Heavens, no, there were servants, tons of them. Downstairs, though, but they hardly counted. Upstairs right now, it really was just her and her nephew, a precious baby boy in his cot. She was attending to him for the moment. Her brother and sister-in-law were out for a carriage drive with her mother, and her father was on some sort of manly errand involving financial affairs and solicitors. Martha was goo-gooing at the baby, and he was smiling back at her before gently falling asleep. She turned, gazed out of the nursery window. Evening was descending, and she could not help but be impressed by the beauty of the sky. I'll quote from O'Donnell here directly, for this phrasing is rather pleasing. The sun had disappeared, but the effects of its rays were still apparent on the western horizon, where the heavens were washed with alternate streaks of gold and red and pink, the colour of each streak excessively brilliant in the centre, but paling towards the edges. Here and there were golden, pink-tipped clouds and crimson islets surrounded with seas of softest blue, and outside the limits of this sun-kissed pale, the blue of the sky grew gradually darker and darker, until its line was altogether lost in the black shadows of night that, creeping over the lone mountain-tops in the far east, slowly swept forward. Wafted by the gentle breeze came the dull moaning and whispering of the pines, the humming of the wind through the telephone wires, and the discordant cawing of the crows. And it seemed to Martha, as she sat there looking out into the garden, that over the whole atmosphere of the place had come a subtle and hostile change. A change in the noise of the trees, the birds, the wind, a change in the flower-scented ether, a change, a most marked and emphatic change in the shadows. Some noise, the baby stirring in his crib perhaps, made her jump, prompted her to look around, and all at once Martha became aware of how dark the room had become. She cast her eyes into the gloom. Memories of those terrible events came pouring back, and a great sense of unease took a hold of her. She peered around apprehensively, goose flesh forming. In the grey-black light, furniture took on a sinister air. The great mass of a cupboard seemed to loom at her. A chest of drawers squatted low and ominously. What was that in the chair? A hideous black form. Martha started to panic, backed away towards the window, but as she moved, the illusion dissipated, and she saw that it was merely a blanket hung over the back of the chair and piled upon it. Left there by the nurse, no doubt. She breathed a deep sigh, and with it came a laugh of relief. And she kept on laughing. Tried to prevent it becoming uncontrollable. In fact, it was so funny. It felt so good to laugh. Something glinted in the room, and she was shocked out of her laughing fit. What was that? Glittering in the darkness like two evil eyes. She jumped. But when they did not move, she crept forward in a state of hideous fascination, and that wild laugh took a hold of her again, for it was scissors, just a pair of scissors, the eyes, the handles. Giggling with relief, Martha picked them up, held them delicately, gently caressed the blades with her thumb. She looked from the scissors to the baby sleeping peacefully in the crib, looked back at the scissors, giggled. She felt it before she saw it, a pressure around her waist, a shadowy arm wrapped around it. She turned her head and found herself face to face with the piper, bloodless, leaden visage, a malevolent grin, bright yellow leering eyes pressing closely into hers. She did not cry out, but struggled to free herself from the phantom's grasp. But it was in vain, and with a supernatural strength he was pushing her, forcing her towards the cradle. Ice-cold hands took Martha's finger and thumb and forced them into the handles of the scissors. And she snapped the blades open, turned to look down at the baby, the only joy now left in this house. He slept quietly, as she beheld his tiny little fingers, tiny little toes. How white he was, even in the darkness, seemed to glow with a cherubic innocence. She looked at the scissors, and at the baby, and at the scissors, and a smile slowly crept over her face, and the laughing returned. The room was lit by moonlight as she raised her hand, and there was the silver flash of the blade stabbing downwards and up and downwards again and again, accompanied by peals of laughter all the while. The piper had released her from his grasp already, and when she was done, Martha turned to him. Bloody scissors clattered to the floor. Unprompted, she took the piper in her arms, fixed him with a grin just as wild and awful as his for her, and she and the piper danced a minuet in the moonbeams, until he backed away, produced his pipes, and began playing a wild, weird dirge, marching slowly backwards into the darkness, gleaming evil eyes focused on hers, disappearing out of the window, the dreadful drone slowly fading until it too was gone. All was still, quiet, and then Martha turned to the crib. The smile fell from her face, and she screamed, and screamed, and screamed. No one believed Martha's story, except perhaps her father and mother, who had witnessed some of the strangeness, but even they couldn't argue with the sickeningly visceral evidence, that tiny ribboned corpse, or argue with Ernest and his wife, who declared Martha driven mad by the deaths of her sisters, motivated by a deep jealousy, the act of a childless woman. The courts, in what must have been a sensational case, found Martha, name change for anonymity of course, found her guilty but insane. and so she had been sent to the specialised criminal lunatic department of Perth Prison, there to be detained indefinitely. Where, of course, I reside to this very day. And that, Mr. O'Donnell, is the end of my story. The woman who O'Donnell would call Martha trailed off. Just repeating, it was the piper. It was the piper. It was all the piper, all the piper. With a cliched perfect timing, there came a rattling of keys, a metal door swinging open, a voice saying, "Visiting hours are over, Mr. O'Donnell." Elliot picked his hat up from the table, placed it on his head, and stood up from his chair. "Thank you for everything, ma'am." "You believe me, don't you?" she asked imploringly. He regarded her with a great seriousness. "I do. And in my book I will tell people the true story." She broke into a wide grin. "Thank you, thank you." Tears of gratitude began to well up in her eyes. Elliot O'Donnell turned and left the cell behind him as she called for one last time, "It was the piper!" O'Donnell would have dearly liked to visit Donaldgowerie House himself, but already by the time of his visit to Martha it had been torn down, and hopefully its murderous ghost had gone with it. He had the good grace not to visit the rest of the family in what must be their time of endless grief. 2 young women and an infant dead. A 3rd woman confined to a madhouse for the rest of her natural life. Few cases he dealt with were as grim as this, a testament to the awful power of the supernatural. O'Donnell might have wanted to visit Martha again, get some more details, but he wouldn't get the opportunity. Within a month, she too was dead. It was said her conscience had done for her. But Elliot would do as he'd promised, write up this tale, include it in one of his ghost books, so that the truth could be known. It was a cold night outside the asylum. He swung himself up into his waiting carriage, journeyed in silence, slowly absorbing the full impact of that awful story.
Back at his bed and breakfast, he was greeted by the landlady.
"Mr. O'Donnell, oh, you're back." He picked up on something. She looked disturbed, rattled. "Is something the matter?" he asked. "Oh, no, it's nothing at all." "You can tell me," said O'Donnell kindly. No, you're a fine gent. You'd think me foolish." "Try me." "No, yeah, it's only... I don't suppose you believe in ghosts, do you?" Elliot O'Donnell gave a kindly smile. "As a matter of fact, I do." He took off his hat, and as she starts to tell her tale and O'Donnell listens intently, the volume fades, the narrative camera zooms further and further out until it passes through the walls of that little guest house, very much like a phantom piper. And that is that. As I said at the start, I'm not going to do a discussion section. I kind of covered most of that at the start, though I would like to do a deep dive into Elliot O'Donnell at some point because he is a truly fascinating figure to me. I am, though, going to give a massive thank you to you for listening to this podcast still, even though I don't produce it very often. I know it sounds odd to say, but I have genuinely large plans for this that are slowly working their way into motion. And I hope things change very soon. Expect to see maybe a little bit more of me on social media. And after that, well, we'll see how things go. I want to give a massive thanks to my Patreon members, of course. Thank you all so much for continuing to subscribe. To anyone who hasn't subscribed yet, you can sign up to a Patreon. You get, I think it's 13, 14 episodes now available there, and you only ever pay when I do a new episode. A massive thanks to Michelle McKibben, who signed up since the last episode. That's that. I hope you have a wonderful 2026. Happy New Year, everybody. I've now decided on the next main feed episode, and it is going to feature a very big cow. Thank you very much. You can follow Tales of Britain and Ireland podcast on Blue Sky, Instagram, Threads and Facebook. There's also a website, talesofbritainandireland.com, where there's a page for each episode which contains more information including illustrations, asides and recaps, along with other additional bits and pieces to explore. The intro music was written and performed by Alice Nichols, and the outro music by Mitch Keeley and Josh Newman. And you can find all the other musical credits on the episode page on the website. If you enjoyed this podcast, then please do share it with others or give it a review, as those really are the best ways to help us out. You can also join Tales of Britain and Ireland on Patreon to get extra members episodes. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope you'll join me again soon.